Yes. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to the European Studies Centre. My name is Briddick, and I'm an Associate Professor of International Human Rights and Refugee Law at ODID and here at St Antony's in the European Studies Centre. I'm absolutely delighted to welcome our two speakers this evening, who are going to talk us about the new European Parliament and Commission. Now, we have rather wonderful audiences here at the ESC, so I know that many of you will know that the 2024 European elections have reshaped the political landscape of the European Union, that we have a new Parliament and a new Commission with new priorities, new concerns, and with a new president in the White House, a pretty significant inbox and to-do list, I would suggest. Our speakers this evening are going to explore and hopefully cast some light on the current power play in Brussels, examining parties, coalitions, who's victorious, who's lost out, and what the dynamics of their influence are in different regimes and contexts. More importantly, they're going to give us an assessment of what lies ahead for European governance and European integration, that being a specialist topic I know of yours. So our first speaker is Klaus Welle, visiting professor at KU Leuven, yes, professor in practice at the LSE, leader in residence at the Colin Powell School for Civic and Global Leadership, and chair of the Academic Council of the Martin Centre in Brussels. You can see why I have to read all of those prestigious appointments in order to get them correct. Klaus has been involved in high-level European politics for over 30 years, including as Secretary General of the European Parliament. Our second speaker is Antony Teasdale, also a visiting professor in practice at the European Institute at LSE, and Executive Director of European, a network of 17 universities that was started off here at St Antony's. He's also an adjunct professor at Columbia. Antony also has a very distinguished career advising ministers nationally in the UK and internationally at the EU Council of Ministers. We're delighted to have them both join us this evening. They're going to speak for around 20 minutes, and taking in turns, and then we're going to open the floor for conversation and discussion. So please do note down your questions as we go, and hopefully we'll have a very enlightening evening. Over to you, Klaus.
I will speak from here because I can keep better eye contact normally. I also see if somebody's falling asleep, which is always the ultimate success criteria that this is not going to happen. So thank you very much for the invitation here, and especially the opportunity to appear together with Antony, who is not only a former colleague but also a long-time friend. Think about the new European Commission and European Parliament, who won the 2024 power play. So that's raising a number of questions. Because on a national level, you wouldn't need to ask that question. It's pretty easy. Somebody won the election, you have a new government, the other side in the opposition, so the question kind of answers itself. So why do we have to ask this question? We have to ask this question because the European Union system is different. In political science, you say the European Union is a separation of power system, not a fusion of power system. Our national systems are fusion of power, which means parliamentary majority, majority in government. If parliamentary majority is no longer there, the government has to resign, new elections, and so on. We don't have this in the European Union. It's much more complicated. We have independent institutions, the Commission, the Council, we have the Parliament, a little bit like the House, Senate, and the administration in the United States, especially if they have different majorities. It's also more complicated, and I enjoy to use this expression in this country, because the European Union is a federal system. It's not a federal state, but it's a federal union. Federal union in the sense that we have a division of power on the federated level of the system in independent institutions, also between the European level, the national level, and the regional level, because that's the real meaning of federalism. And why is the system different? It is different because this is the stability condition if you want to organize a system of continental scale. If you have a national system, let's say very well established nation state, then you can do 51% against 49. The 49% accept to be out for 4 years or 5 years, more or less. If you want to build up a democracy on a European level, with 27 states, going from Madeira to the Black Sea, going from the Finnish North to Cyprus, you cannot exclude over 4 and 5 years, let's say, in a systematic way, 49% electoral European Parliament. And that's why we are not having 51 against 49, but we have something which is much more complicated. And in fact, we have a parliament of minorities. Very small minorities and very big minorities. But they're minorities. Nobody just on their own can impose its political will on the other one. Biggest minority, which is the EPP, is maybe 25%. Maybe impressive, maybe not. Not a majority. It's a parliament of minorities. And because of this, people know you want to achieve something politically, you have to cooperate. You cannot impose. You have to build alliances. And you don't know who would be ready to support you. And sometimes support is coming from corners where you least suspect it. And that means you always have to be open for cooperation. You cannot just denigrate somebody because it's not of your family, because maybe that's the vote that's helping you to be in a majority and be successful with your legislative project tomorrow. So, what has been the outcome of the elections? Now, of course, we need to simplify a little bit. My reading is, I would like to offer, that basically after the elections, you have 1/3 of the members on the left group, the socialist group, and the green group. You have a good third in the center. Antony has made precise calculations, so he could tell us that it's 37%. Let's call it a good third in the center. That's the EPP and the Liberals. And you have a small third on the right of the EPP. And this small third on the right of the EPP in the past did not exist to that extent. It's basically been growing since 2009. Is this something which is very European Parliament specific? Not really. Look at our member states. Le Pen, 30% in France. AfD, 21, 22 in Germany. Nigel Farage, recently top of the polls in Britain. FPÖ in Austria, not 30%, but the strongest party, close to 30%. So, in fact, what you see in the European Parliament is a kind of mirror of how the national party systems are evolving. So if we nowadays have a small third to the right of the EPP, that's the situation also in our member states, and that's not something very special in the European Parliament. Secondly, and that is significant, in the last parliament, you still had what was called a progressive majority. Of course, we can always have a philosophical debate. What is progress? Where is progress? Does somebody know where is progress, or is it unknown? That's a different story. But there was a majority from the left, the Greens, the Socialists, and the Liberals. It was not the standard majority, only in 10, 15, let's say 10, 15, maximum 20% of the cases. But in case of disagreement, that majority could be there. So if there was no agreement across the center, that majority could constitute itself or the progressive majority. So that progressive majority in this parliament does not exist anymore. The four parties to the left of the EPP have fallen below 45%. That means unless there are major defections from the other groups, this majority does not exist anymore, and I think this will have serious consequences. So how is this then all playing out in practice? I would argue that the weeks just after the European elections, when the Commission President needs to be elected by the European Parliament, that's the moment of maximum weakness, both of the candidate and of the Commission. In fact, more of the candidate than of the Commission, because if she fails, she will be replaced as somebody new, the Commission still exists. You could also say, nowadays, that's the moment of maximum strength of the European Parliament. Because you have a candidate who wants to be elected, and that candidate needs an absolute majority of members elected to the House, 361 out of 720. But your own group has only 25%, roughly. And is everybody supportive in their own group? Not so clear. So that means a candidate, whoever it is, now Ursula von der Leyen, has to build her majority. Doesn't have it. And how does she do this? She has to do this through establishing a kind of governing program. You know, the socialists will not vote for Ursula von der Leyen, who's from the EPP, because she's nice and beautiful. In case she is nice and beautiful, huh? That's a question of appreciation. Huh? They will want to know what's happening on the program side. Any of our content there or not. The Liberals the same. The Greens the same. ECR, Conservatives the same. 20 years ago, or more, I remember vividly when Romano Prodi was the proposer. I was group secretary general of the EPP group at the time, and we didn't like Prodi because we had won the election, so I should be Prodi, it's not belong to our family. The compromise was done on some institutional demands. So we were asking that if Prodi asks the commissioner to resign, the commissioner has to resign, and so on. Nowadays, political groups have very precise demands on content. What should happen over the next 5 years? I've seen the letters from the EPP to Ursula von der Leyen. I've seen the letter from the Socialist to Ursula von der Leyen. I've seen a third letter, I think it was either from the Liberals or the Greens to von der Leyen. These are very detailed demands. And when it comes to the moment of election, the Commission President gives a speech, and the political groups take notes, and they tick off boxes. Are our key points in? then normally there are group meetings. It's interrupted, there are group meetings, and the groups are discussing, is it enough, is it not enough, can we support, can't we support? So that means the election and also changed majorities in the European Parliament have a direct consequence on what is going to happen content-wise in the European Union. And then there's something very specific. When you have a look at how is the European Commission as a governing apparatus functioning differently from a normal government? I would argue the difference is the Commission at the very beginning sets out its strategy for 5 years. Then the commissioners get instructed what is expected from them to do. Then the Commission services start to work. They take about a year, maybe 1.5 years. And then it's a phase of rollout, where then Parliament becomes very busy with amendments and the Council becomes very busy with amendments. But this means what is decided as strategic at the very beginning is very likely to determine a full 5-year cycle. And what you put in at the beginning is going to be with you for a very long time, unless then there are, really huge upheavals, like, let's say, like the Russian aggression. So that meant last time in 2019, top priority was the Green Deal. And for 5 years, we had the Green Deal rolled out. This time, the agreement with Parliament is priority number 1, competitiveness. Priority number 2, security. With 3 components: defense, border protection, migration. So my bet would be that what we are going to see rolled out, it's not the only things, but what are the key priorities over the next 5 years? It's competitiveness, defense, border protection, and migration, reflecting a shifting majority in the European Parliament as the outcome of these European elections. So, who has won this game? I would argue that there are, or let's put it like this, that we could describe the situation in 4 circles of power in this legislation. And the circles of power are determined by your position in the system, where you positioned, on the fringes or in the center. Secondly, by the posts, which give you the possibility to execute that power. And thirdly, by the program that's going to be rolled out over the next 5 years. So 4 circles of power defined by position, posts, and program. Contrary to the last European Parliament, where the position in the center of the system was with the Liberal group, the position in the center of the system this time is with the EPP group, European People's Party. In what sense? If you look at the hemicycle, the EPP occupies center-right, center-left. There are a lot of members from the EPP sitting on the center-left now in Parliament because the right has been growing. That means difficult to form majorities on the left of the EPP, difficult to form majorities on the right EPP unless there's cooperation between the very right and the left. At the same time, half of the commissioners in the European Commission for the EPP, some on the left, some on the right. About half of the governments in the European Union and the European Council, some on the left, some on the right. So, position in the center, this time contrary to the last legislature occupied by the EPP. The same for posts, key post Commission President, first half at least of Parliament President, EPP. and program competitiveness, security, much more EPP than the Green Deal last time. The second circle of power, I would argue, is the alliance between EPP, Socialists, and Liberals. Because again, there has been alliance across the center. The three parties occupy all the key positions. That means also the President of the European Council, the High Representative Liberals, President of the European Council Socialists. And they have established together a governing program and a kind of coalition agreement. That means the willingness is there to continue with an alliance across the center. And that has put these three parties, EPP, Socialists, and Liberals, together in what I would call the second circle of power. The third circle of power, from my point of view, is the ECRU, European Conservative and Reformists, and the Green Group. So more distant again from the center. Why? Both groups voted Ursula von der Leyen with about half their members. Half the members of the ECR voted, especially Meloni, Czech ODS, NVA. Half of the Green Group voted, especially the German Greens, but not the French Greens and not the Regionalists. So half of these two wanted to be on board. The other half of both groups wanted to send a sign of protest and disagreement. The fourth circle of power is not in power. So that's the very right and the very left. I would call those on the ECR and those who on the Greens who have voted the von der Leyen Commission the constructive right and the constructive left. I hesitate to call those who are outside the destructive right and destructive left. But to a certain extent, it's the logic of, let's say, this analysis. Destructive, at least in the sense that they didn't want to provide support for the new executive, which is the European Commission. So to come to an end of my part, and then Antony will speak, the conclusion. And the winner is. So who is the winner? I would say first and foremost, the winner is the European Union. Because when you look around in the member states, this is an anchor of stability. The European Union is an anchor of stability. France definitely is not. Germany, for the moment, is not. Britain, I understood this is no longer a member of the European Union, but I don't have the impression that for the moment it's an anchor of stability. So with these difficulties to manage, I think the process of reconstituting the institution has shown that the European Union in an environment of instability is an anchor of stability. Of course, we could also argue for EPP, we can argue for Ursula von der Leyen. I love to argue for the Spitzenkandidaten system because the lead candidate is back. I was accused in 2014 by the Financial Times, page 3, half a page portrait. There have been the devious mind behind the Spitzenkandidaten. It's now on my wall in my office. I was not the only devious mind, but I was happy that I was among the devious mind. And the Spitzenkandidat is back because Ursula von der Leyen was a Spitzenkandidat and she was successful. So those who had been hoping in 2019 that this was the final word and the Spitzenkandidat was finally buried, including President Macron, have not been proven right. I could also say the member states. Why the member states? Have a close look at the nominations for individual commissioners. The Lithuanians can deal with defense. I think that's something that's interesting them pretty much. The Estonians have the High Representative. You know, if you're that if you are in Estonia, that it's also something which should be quite interesting. The Austrians can deal with migration. The French are allowed to deal with strategic sovereignty. Let's say the Mediterranean can deal with, and so on. So what I want to say, obviously, the member states' priorities have been respected also in the choice of commissioners. And this is a bit the story behind the European Union. It's not 51 against 49. You have to take many interests into account. So at the end of the day, there have been many winners of this battle as a stability condition for the European Union. Thank you.
Thank you very much. What's your district?
Yes, Teasdale.
Thank you very much, everybody, for inviting us. And well, I'm going to say a few words, not a great length, because I think question answer is critically important to this. But I think that one thing that's very important to keep in mind all the time about the European Union is the resilience of the system. All of these European elections, not only this one, but previous European elections, are built up as kind of test cases of whether the EU can survive, whether the system is going to be taken over, in this case, whether it will be taken over by populist forces. This is not a new narrative. It's a narrative we've seen in successive European elections, certainly the last 15 or so years. I think it underestimates the extent to which the Union has a kind of inner capability and resilience, which is simply generated by what the French call engrenage, the process of progressive interlocking of the various interests within the system, and the fact that interests are refracted through, represented, and are made more powerful by the way that the committee system in the European Parliament operates. You have a very decentralized European Parliament. People outside focus on the plenary, they focus on the political groups, and both of those are, of course, extremely important. But the real power structure of the European Parliament lies in the committee system. It lies in the way in which different political forces, different interests, national, ideological, regional, sexual, and so on, are effectively brought together in a way that results in some kind of sustainable compromise. And once that compromise has been adopted, in a system which requires supermajorities, after all, it tends to stick. And these outcomes become cumulative. And therefore, the shock to the system is nowhere near as great as media analysts and commentators well, try to project it. Because there is that kind of carryover of policy and an inner strength in the system, which, as I say, I think is often underestimated. The second is that, reflecting that, there is higher continuity of policy between successive European Commissions than the way that it's very often presented publicly. At the moment, there's high fashionability to the idea that there's some kind of U-turn occurring in the European Union between essentially the digital agenda and the green agenda, which was pioneered by VDL1, or 1.0, as I think we now describe these successive presidencies, and the new competitiveness and security agenda, which Klaus referred to in VDL2. The reality is that the first carries forward into the second, and there's a huge amount of implementation of established positions and law that's been adopted, and a huge amount has been. In the same way as if you go back to the single market, say 30, 40 years ago, it didn't require constant revolution for the fact that the single market became progressively embedded over successive European elections and didn't run out of steam just because you got the turning point of 1992 and its so-called completion. So likewise, in the previous European Commission, you did have an underlying commitment to competitiveness and security. And events, of course, intervened. The new security agenda was generated more than anything else by the growing instability of the international environment, by the politicization and instrumentalization of supply chains, and by the obvious need for people to have a higher degree of self-reliance than was previously the case. And the whole strategic autonomy debate was about that, and that really dates from the late 2010s rather than now. So I think it's very important not to see this as some sort of dramatic change of emphasis. However, it is true that Ursula von der Leyen has become progressively more powerful as this time's gone on. And she has chosen, I think, in the way that she's put together the new commission, to exploit the potential for her to become more powerful still. We see that not only in the fact that there are fewer big figures around her, with less kind of perceived political legitimacy. After all, in the first von der Leyen commission, you had a situation where two of the three executive vice presidents in the form of Palestinians on one hand and Margareta Vestager on the other, had themselves been Spitzenkandidaten in the 2019 election. And that gave a kind of political cover, if you like, to her, for the fact that she herself, of course, had not gone through the Spitzenkandidat process. She has the additional legitimacy, therefore, of having fought, get the nomination for the EPP, which was not foregone for the EPP, and fought to go forward and get the absolute majority that was required in the European Parliament, and did so by a decisive margin this time, when she it was a very close run thing 5 years ago. But she was doing all that in a context in which she was perceived publicly, I think, I'm wrong about this, but I think she was seen publicly to have stepped up well to the big challenges of the previous 5 years and have handled it in a forceful leadership way, which had earned respect for her. But not all of the people who, of course, were voting on her in last July, when the vote was in September or July, I'm trying to remember, when the vote occurred on Ursula von der Leyen in July in Strasbourg, were, of course, in the previous European Parliament. She had a very high degree of turnover in the most recent 60% turnover in the previous European Parliament elections. So there are relatively few people around in the European Parliament who actually have much political recollection beyond 10 to 15 years in good cases. She was doing it in a context where she was having to renew all the time her authority, her credibility, and her fear. Now, Klaus mentioned the figures, and I just want to take a moment to just give a bit of detail on this to show how big a change there has actually been. Before the last European elections in June this year, the centre left, as it can be broadly described, namely, our characterisation of the situation is slightly different. I think the Renew Europe group, formerly the Liberal group, has been moving in a progressively left-wing direction. But the attempt to balance political forces, which Guy Verhofstadt pioneered over many years, was upset decisively by the inclusion of a very large number of Macronistas within the Liberal group, now renamed the Renew Europe group. That force you would have assumed would be more in the centre-right, because people tend to associate Macron as being more of a centre-right kind of politician. But in fact, actually, the members of the European Parliament and their leadership from Renaissance in France have tended more towards centre-left, and voting figures show this shift in successive parliaments in the last two parliaments. So I would characterise Renew Europe more as a centre-left political force, and if you add together Renew Europe, the Socialist Democrats, and the left group, we saw them go down as a proportion of the European Parliament from 50.1% that is a very big shift by historic standards in the European Parliament. And the parties to the right of the EPP, so you're talking about the European Conservatives and Reformists, and now two distinct political groups, the Patriots and the ESN. The Patriots are, if you like, the mainstream hard-right group, and the ESN is more of a kind of cover, effectively, for Alternative for Deutschland. That grouping went up, depending on how you define people even to their right, or various elements that aren't members of either of those groups, from 44.2% to 52.4%. And this is the origin of the phenomenon that Klaus was referring to. If you're the president of the European Parliament and you're sitting up on the perch there looking down, previously, you could almost invariably, and I used to work for two presidents of the European Parliament, Klaus was the chief of staff to one of them, you could almost invariably work out the result without the numbers being flagged up on the screen, simply by dint of who was voting on which side of the central aisle directly in front of you. The forces of the EPP and those to the right constituted in successive European parliaments essentially 50%, just under, and those to the left of the EPP, maybe 50%, were just over. That shift of effectively 5% is the dynamic which people are now talking about, which is changing the politics of the European Parliament and by implication, politics in Brussels. But I think it's very important not to exaggerate or overemphasize the ability of the right to act effectively in these circumstances. For several reasons, but the most important of which relates to what I described just a moment ago, which is to do with the power of committees. Because each of the committees in the European Parliament goes forward from legislature to legislature with its own set of priorities and values, very often complex outcomes of the triangulation of vested interests. And it's extremely difficult for any force which isn't part of that process to upset it, disturb or let alone overturn it. And these committee centres of gravity, if you like, are themselves often quite different. I mean, clearly the centre of gravity in the Environment Committee is not the same as in the Industry Committee. Centre of gravity in the Social Affairs and Employment Committee is not the same as in the Economic and Monetary Committee or in the Single and Internal Market Committee. It's very difficult, these centrifugal forces in the European Parliament, that it's actually very difficult for leadership components, whether they're the leaders of political groups or they're the president of the European Parliament, to have any discernible effect on them, other than when they come dramatically into some kind of clash. And then it's possible to try to arbitrate between them. But that's not the norm. The norm is rather the opposite. And it's become more so over time because of the operation of the co-decision procedure, the way that the trial process works, in which behind closed doors, agreements are struck between the relevant commissioner or PG that he or she might be leading, the Council of Ministers represented by its presidency, very keen to do a deal, and the key members, the chair, the rapporteur, shadow rapporteurs from the relevant parliamentary committee. And to get that deal overturned by plenary is a rare phenomenon. It can occur when the position of a particular committee gets increasingly out of line with where the balance of power lies or balance of opinion lies in the European Parliament as a whole. But it's relatively rare. It was starting to happen on the Green Deal before the last European elections. And the EPP, this predates the shift to the right that we're just describing here in the last elections. EPP found its position increasingly unstable as a result, because EPP members had been agreeing sometimes to things in the Environment Committee which the EPP support wouldn't accept, and which the Parliament as a whole might push back on. And so there were several incidents in the run-up to the European elections where the EPP found itself in trouble, and the Parliament teetered on the process of reversing the position which the committee had adopted, and in some cases, which they had negotiated into the agreement with the Council of Ministers. That is, I think, now less likely. What you're going to see is that the EPP's more conservative, in inverted commas, position on the Green Deal will be reflected in the deals themselves that are struck, and therefore that the position of the Parliament as a whole and the position of, say, the Environment Committee, or indeed any other committee, probably would be better aligned. But the EPP now finds itself very much as the kingmaker in inverted commas, in the sense that which way it goes will determine the outcome of any left-right vote in the European Parliament, whereas previously that was the position, as Klaus mentioned, of the Renew group. There's a lot more that I can say about that, but let me just give you a concrete example of what we're talking about. The European Commission is announcing for this week its annual work programme in 2025. And there are 53 initiatives that will be proposed. 12 of those are in the area of competitiveness, 7 in the area of simplification, 4 in the area of innovation, 5 in the area of security, 3 in the area of preparedness and resilience, 2 in the area of migration. And what you might consider to be a more actively centre-left agenda are reflected in 1 on sustainability and 2 on policy. Geopolitics is 3, could be interpreted any way you choose. But the point I'm making is that there has been a course correction. We see this now in terms of new initiatives. But everything else that's been proposed, remember, and adopted in the past, and 97% of legislation proposed by the European Commission gets adopted, of course, is not only on the statute book, or will be on the statute book, but when it is adopted, because there's still about 100 pieces of outstanding business from the previous Commission, that momentum, even if it is somewhat broken, is not lost. And the outcome will be, in the course of the next 5 years, almost certainly something more approaching the mainstream policies that we have seen in the past, but with a rather more centre-right tilt. It won't be the adoption of some far-right agenda. That's how I see it, based on my own experience working in the European Parliament. I think in all of this, it's very important to try to escape the stereotypical reporting which journalists and many other commentators, including other commentators, tend to find quite attractive and interesting.
Start us off with comments or questions. Yes.
I would like to ask whether the budget follows these vagaries of shifts of power and so on. Are they reflected in the budget? And because cash flows may make enormous differences from this decision.
I think that's exactly what we are now waiting to see. I've seen today that there was a leak in the Commission about major, let's say, decentralization of traditional spending. There were earlier, I haven't read it in detail, there were earlier reports already that regional policy and part of agricultural policy would be renationalized. But I would expect major shifts in the budget in favor of defense. To a certain extent, we are seeing this already. The Commission has taken a decision that unused regional funds, and because of Next Generation EU, it seems that 93% of the regional funds at this moment are unused, and, for example, be used for military mobility. Depending on what the countries want, that also depends on their geographical position. That's a major breakthrough, I would say, in favor of defense financing. I'm personally of the opinion that we will see a major package, maybe like Next Generation EU. Others, like President Tusk, have just proposed to do this through a bank in favor of defense. Why? Because we have Russia's aggression, and we see a major shift in American policy. I mean, people have difficulties to make sense out of what is the common thing of Greenland and Mexico and Panama and Canada. I think there's one thing in common, which is that this is all what is in the Western Hemisphere. And if you think of American foreign policy before 1945, it was all focused on the Western Hemisphere. That means in the defense of their immediate environment. Whereas policy instruments that had a global reach, like, for example, US aid, are basically destroyed. I mean, for the moment, 300 out of 10,000 jobs will be maintained. Maybe something's going to be recreated. We don't know. I had a meeting last week with somebody who is heading the International Republican. So you maybe should think that this is spared. Huh? He had to tell his staff last Friday that half of them had to go, and so it's still very early days. But if I should make some sense out of it, I would say focus on the Western Hemisphere, immediate surrounding of the United States, Greenland, Canada, Mexico, Panama, and at the same time, drastic cuts in what is the wider world. And I mean, when I studied economics, we were told that if you ask McKinsey into your company, you can be sure that the recommendation is cut 1/3 of your staff. I think if you ask Elon Musk to do an evaluation, since Twitter, we know that the standard recommendation is cut 80% of your staff. He's just been invited to check on the Pentagon. I don't know what it means, but I don't have the impression that this is a prelude for more means for the Pentagon. So, in other words, we are threatened on the European continent. I think the American guarantee is becoming very fragile. And this means we have to build up our own capacity, and very quickly means in the mandate of this commission. And given that the member states themselves have huge budgetary troubles, sometimes self-imposed, sometimes because they did spend too much in the past, they're self-imposed in the case of Germany, spent too much in the past in the case of France and others, or Italy. I think they will be looking for a way out. And I think the way out they will find is the European Union budget or a special arrangement in parallel to next generation.
Michael Ignatieff had a very interesting essay in the FT recently where he made that point in terms of the US sphere of influence and a retrenchment to that very traditional approach. And one of the things he argued in response for European states in particular to do was to act more collaboratively. And yet when we saw some of the cuts that you mentioned to US aid, when we see threats to the territorial integrity, potentially in the EU country, we're not seeing that, well, we're not seeing externally, at least, that collaborative response. In terms of the shift to the right that you are identifying here, does that make it easier for the EU to engage with Trump or to contest him, to be able to have conversations about some of these areas? Or is there a different kind of chart that needs to be intact by the EU as a militant?
Yeah. One I think would say is we have to look at the different rights, and I like to classify them as constructive right and destructive right. There are many ways to look at them, but what is interesting for me is their position towards the system overall. Who is trying to destroy the European Union, and who has different policy proposals within the European Union? For me, that makes a big difference. We can also have other differentiations, but for me, this is essential. And there we see that some, let's say AfD, I would also argue Viktor Orban, in the Patriots and so on, they try to destroy the European Union. They would be very happy without us. Whereas others, especially in the ECR, and including Meloni, are not. Which means Meloni engages on common rules on the foreign border, on the external border, whereas Orban is not, whereas law and justice is not. That's for me the dividing criteria. What I find interesting is that Elon Musk is supporting AfD in Germany. Who was invited for the inauguration from France? Not Marine Le Pen, to my surprise. I mean, maybe that speaks in her favor. I don't know. She was not invited, but a presidential candidate further to her right. It's not the conservative leadership which is invited to the inauguration. It's Nigel Farage. So basically, political forces who tried to destroy the political order after 1945. So these people are close, yes, but will they speak in our favor? No. So who can speak, let's say, constructively, I would put this some parts of them, like for example, Giorgia Meloni, but not to others.
Thank you. I have some two questions here. I'm going to take them both and then we'll open up. Yes. Otan.
Yeah, thank you very much. I mean, that is a little follow-up because you've started the conversation about far-right parties in the European Parliament and the fact that they are not like a unified bloc. They belong to three different political families. So, you know, that says something about their unity as well, but also about the more general orientation of a right-wing agenda, I suppose. And there I would like to push you a little bit more as to how do you think they will be kind of responding to these new issues? To what degree they might even feel threatened by Trump's extreme protectionism of the United States that is hurting the European Union and possibly themselves as well in their own domestic politics. And one thing that was interesting, Antony, is that you mentioned that the issue of migration, there were basically, you know, only 2 items in the agenda. That's not very high, right? I mean, that's kind of quite surprisingly optimistic, you know, not to have, you know, big number there.
To me, if they've just done the EU migration pact, and what else have they got to do? I mean, I can certainly ask. Yes.
Well, two things. One is you're looking at the committee structure. One explained not just a subcommittee on disarmament and a full committee. That's one thing that struck me. I don't know whether there are other similar things. Secondly, just taking one of the major groups, and one which I worked in for years. What does the socialist group do now? It's not part of the natural wider centre. What should their policy be? I could also say the liberal group, but I've taken the group I hear well. What do you do if you're a major group but not part of the strategic centre, if you like?
I mean, I think for the socialists it poses a very serious problem, and their initial reaction was to go into overdrive by saying that the EPP had in some way sold out to the far right, and the episode was the outcome of the Venezuelan elections, where the EPP took the position that the left-wing candidate was illegitimate. Of course, the position of the European Parliament has now become actually the position of the socialist group. So they've had to triangulate in effect with that. But that wasn't driven primarily by EP politics, that was driven by international reaction and the position of governments across the West and the West economies. But I noticed that the leadership of the socialist group had a away day last week in Jean Val outside Brussels. And they, their spokesman was reported, at least in Politico, to the extent that you can believe anything you read in Politico. But he or she was reported as saying that they had decided now to adopt a case-by-case approach to legislative funds in the European Parliament, and that whilst they didn't seek in any way the support of the far right, it might on occasion be necessary simply to get things through. That would, of course, apply if the left wanted to unite with the far right in order to defeat the EPP. And of course, the thing the EPP most hates in this situation is when both sides defeat them. And this actually occurred in the Conference of Presidents, I believe, a week or two ago, where there was a vote on an agenda item for the division of the plenary, in which the EPP was in a minority. And this gave quite satisfaction to virtually everybody in the room. So there could be no hubris or triumphalism on the part of the EPP. But it's a very serious problem. It's not dissimilar, actually, to the situation in France, where the socialist group really has to decide, you know, where it wants to line up now that the situation has become so much more permanent, and whether it wants to be part of the governing majority or whether it wants to be in a kind of dominant position. So we'll see. Coming back to the budgetary issue, if I may, since I've got the floor for them. I mean, I think the biggest problem with the budget is not only going to be the fact that the priorities need to shift somewhat to modernise and update it even further, especially with the advent considering new security challenges. But the fact that overhanging all of this is the question of where, in the jargon, is no known resources are going to come from to help finance the repayment of, I think it's around 300 billion euros of outstanding debt under the next generation of the EU. And that day was postponed on the basis that in the interim, which is now, new own resources would be created, which would help solve this problem in 2028 when that debt expires. Nothing so far has really come forward in that direction. And if that is not solved, there will be the need actually for some budgetary cutbacks. So this is going to be a period of really quite tough choices, I think.
I just want to ask a question about the right.
Oh.
The right.
Yes. Yeah, let's say I've listened with interest that some voices are coming out of France from the Pence party, speaking about the necessity of Welle and the fact of her not being invited by somebody else. I find this interesting. It's very early days. We cannot know. But my impression is that the Rassemblement National tries to increasingly portray itself as a kind of unreformed Gaullist party. When I say unreformed Gaullist party, I want to say 1950s, 1960s. Let's not forget the empty chair. It wasn't all smooth sailing with them as well, or maybe 70s or 80s. And in France, if a party takes the R into its name, like Rassemblement, it's normally saying you want to occupy the Gaullist tradition. And I think that would be a kind of completion of their takeover of that political space. So it remains to be seen how they exactly position themselves. But the fact that she was not invited, let's say, I find interesting. It's also interesting to hear, I'm no longer, let's say, in the administration, but it seems there is a change of strategy on the right. For a very long time, I think they saw their main area of activity in plenary, in communication, but not in content work. I hear that this is about changing. So they are, to a certain extent, better organized. The organization on the patriot side, I think, is largely happening by the Fidesz people. Learned the trade when being in the EPP. So it's not just about protest. They want to have a concrete impact. And in general, I can say since Nigel Farage left the parliament, there was a different behavior installed on that side of the hemicycle. Less noisy and more constructive, of course, to achieve what they are looking for. So is this process going to continue? How far? I cannot say. But we are not living anymore in the times of where these parties were happy to be protest parties and to have visibility, let's say, coming from this. You mentioned the Defense Committee. Let's say in my function as chair of the Academic Council of the Martin Center, we issued a number of publications which were called the 7 Ds for Sustainability, because my view was that on 7 areas, which conveniently all start with D, we are not future-proof: defense, digital, debt, democracy, decarbonization, and holistic globalization. And on defense, we proposed 1.5 years ago a full defense committee, a defense commissioner, more money for military mobility, a new DARPA, and 6 other things. The first 4 have been happening now. Have a defense commissioner, which seems very strange 2 years ago. Have a full defense committee, We had much more money for military mobility, and the commissioner has expressed himself in favor of an EU DAPA. So when we look at parties, I would argue we have to look at ecosystems, which include the party, their political foundation, the parliamentary groups, and ideas are not only born in the European Commission space.
I have a question here first, and I'm going to go over here, so go ahead.
Thank you. I spent nearly 40 years working for the Commission, and clearly you have focused to a very great extent on the implications of the European Parliament elections. And you've also commented that Ursula von der Leyen comes out of this reinforced in terms of legitimacy and also implicitly in terms of competition within the Commission, as compared with BDL 1.0. What I think this also means is that we've seen over a longer timescale than just the von der Leyen Commission, a progressive strengthening of the role of the President and the Secretariat General within the Commission in terms of how the Commission is run and so forth. When I look back to my early days in the Commission, a very long time ago. But what I wonder is, how far does this reflect, in a sense, that the Commission as an institution is evolving more towards the sort of approach of a national government? In that things are very much now driven by the President, and in particularly this time, reading the latest comments on the budget proposals, which you referred to, Klaus, there is a suggestion in some of the reporting today that essentially von der Leyen and a couple of other senior commissioners will basically be driving the whole budgetary process in a way which was not the case in the past, where you had much more fighting. What are your thoughts on that? Because that's also important, I think, in terms of what was called the power struggle, the power within Brussels.
Add my footnote,
Yes,
because
go
it's simply, I mean, Jonathan's put my question probably much better than I. I was going to ask in a naive way that we understood when this project was invented that it was driven by a elite managed European Commission. But listening particularly to the list of initiatives and how they'd switched, one is now getting the feeling that the European Parliament, as we know over the last 10, 15 years, has gained much more relative power to the Commission. My question, which is very much Jonathan's, is what is the role what role does the Commission have in terms of politics? Does it still abrogate to itself a role of kind of being a bulwark against kind of extremism in this current discussions about extremism to the right? Or is it more, given your point about the Parliament of minorities, is it kind of dancing much more carefully so that it maintains its sense of authority, and yet behind the scenes swimming underwater and trying to do what it can? I mean, how do we, naive citizens, how do we interpret what's going on there? There's obviously a huge kind of power battle.
I think one more comment on this point, David. Do you want to go ahead?
That's very kind of you. Thank you. In the sort of, with the arrival of Trump, does this offer a real opportunity for the UK government to work with the leaders of the European Union? Not in any sense because we have a special role, but because we don't. We all face the same problem. and we have to work together on that.
You have a lot to get into there, so take the
Well,
points as
on
you wish.
the very interesting questions about the role of the European Commission. I mean, the Commission finds itself in a very, I mean, somebody wants to. Institutions would understand that. But can we? Yeah,
So
but
can you speak up?
I've got a point. Don't worry. The Commission finds itself in a kind of double bind, because on the one hand it wants, because it's not an elected body, it's got this sort of technocratic character, which I think still remains a strong feature of its making, in its DNA. And because it's supposed to represent some broader pan-European interest above the interests of the United States, it has a legitimacy. So it solves this legitimacy problem by going into alliance with other bodies which have democratic mandates. One is the European Council, comprised of heads of state and government, or heads of government predominantly, who have all been elected in different ways in the United States and have sustained parliamentary majorities. And the other is the European Parliament, which is elected obviously every 5 years. And so successful Commission presidents, and I've maybe deferred to the role of Jacques Delors and others, have been those that have managed those two interfaces very, very effectively. Delors used the pro-European momentum of the European Parliament in the 1980s, together with very strong personal bilateral relations with individual heads of government or heads of state in the case of François Mitterrand. And it wasn't just a triangulation process, it was a kind of positive feedback loop which he managed to establish. And I think Ursula von der Leyen has actually been trying to do something very similar in the first 5 years of her term as Commission President. So that's not an easy exercise to carry off, but if you can do it, you can get the different components of the system in sync moving forwards together. And I think, I may be wrong about this, but I think the last 5 years generally in the European Parliament, for example, have been characterized by a much more harmonious relationship between the political groups, despite the evidence of polarization that we've been looking at in the statistics. And I think that the different institutions in the European Union have been better aligned. Now, the second thing that's been going on is that the better alignment in part is because the institutions cooperate more closely together at senior level. That was something that was foreseen in the Lisbon Treaty, but notwithstanding the difficulty that the BDL had with Charles Michel, the characterization over the last 15 years or so has been of a closer alignment, if you like, of strategic thinking and planning. The institutions are now, the Commission is in charge under the treaty of annual and multi-annual programming, a concept which never previously existed. The treaty foresees that there can be meetings of the presidents of the European Commission when these periodically do happen. I spent some time when I was in Brussels as secretary of something called the ESPAS process, which is an interinstitutional foresight process in which the Commission, the Parliament, the Council, in both the guises of the Council of Ministers and the European Council, the advisory bodies, the EIB, all sorts of European institutions, bodies and agencies worked together to try to think about the future and try to identify the challenges that were in global trends. This is all relatively new, and I think the strengthening centre of the Commission has made it, I think, a more serious joined up institution. But it's always conscious that if it doesn't step up and fill that gap, that there'll be other people who will set the agenda. The heads of government are never backwards and coming forwards with their views of what should occur. And the European Parliament has been a constant fountainhead over the years of many ideas which have subsequently become absolutely mainstream. I mean, for example, the idea of climate neutrality by 2050 was an idea first in a European Parliament report. We just take it for granted. The idea of the Digital Services Act and the Digital Markets Act, these were ideas that came out of the as of the AI Act, when that was a legislative initiative report in Britain. Now, once they become the official position of the Commission and puts forward legislative proposals and so on, people forget the origins of it. So there's this constant battle for legislative initiative or policy leadership in the process. But this, I think, is the source of strength And good commission presidents and good commissioners harness this. They ride on that tide, that wave, if you like, to carry Europe forward. And it's precisely because the centre has been strengthened in the commission so that departmental rivalries and turf battles and so on, which of course always exist in any bureaucratic structure, that was also in universities, can be somehow suppressed or at least overcome as these different elements align better. I think that's how I look at it.
So I think the commission is changing from a collective body to a presidential system. And I think the reason is basically the reason of number. You have 15 you can sit around the table. You have 27, you cannot. It's a different committee. 27 is not ideal group size. When you look in the commission building, there's still a photo of the first commissioner, all sitting around the round table. Now they sit on a distance with microphone and tapping with the microphone. In the middle is the hall. So I think that's the price we pay that every member state insists to have a commissioner. But it didn't start with her. It started, I think, before. Does she have to dance more carefully? Yes. But with whom? With those in the system who are ready to be constructive. Because those who are anyhow going against everything don't need to make an offer to. And that's, I think, the significance of the vote of this von der Leyen Commission. That half of the ECR group decided to be constructive, half of the ECR group decided not to. Half of the Green group decided to support, half of the Green group decided not to support, like they didn't support all the other commissions since Prodi over the last 20 years. So this was an indication to say, I want to part of the policy agenda. That was the kind of entry fee to be paid. And those who want to be constructive, I think, will be treated in a constructive way. And you can see that, for example, when they're speaking about Italy and its migration problems, all the agreements in Northern Africa, which were done by the European Commission, have been to the direct benefit of Italy and the current government. So it would have been very strange if they had not recognized this. And then the last question on Trump. I think Donald Trump is doing his best to become another European founding father. I'm not sure whether we will build him a statue. Different story. But the external pressures now become overwhelming. I mean, the Russians, the Chinese, and the Americans want Greenland. I mean, that's quite a bit. And if we are not using this momentum, then I don't know what needs to happen for us to use that momentum. For the UK, in the Labour manifesto, you have the triple no. No to the internal market, no to the customs union, no to the freedom of movement of workers. It's not exactly the no of Margaret Thatcher, but it smells a bit like this. So where's the open door? There's only one, and that's on defense. Because the Labour manifesto is open on this. And that's why it was absolutely logical that Keir Starmer was asked to come to an EU summit, especially on defense, because there the interests, I think, are completely aligned.
The question here and then.
Yeah, it's a question to Klaus, really, and it's just you mentioned something that just took me a bit by surprise, and it was when you were talking about defence, and you talked about the amount of regional funds that remained unspent. It's a question about how big a problem is there about unspent money, and how big is the potential to redirect that money to defence? How much money are we talking about? And is the regional example an exception, or is it the norm?
Yeah, I mean, that's a figure I read in the paper, and the reason given was that the member states used first the money from Next Generation EU. So it's not let's say a standard, but it shows that maybe there are unused opportunities for redirecting amounts in the existing financial means in favor of defense.
Thank you so much for the panel. I just wonder about the implications of the elections towards the other external power relations, for example, with the Middle East countries. They are the key advantage for solve the energy crisis in Europe. So what's your view how it will change the picture?
I'm not an expert in the Middle East, but it seems to me that what's happened in Washington recently is going to be affecting the European elections in terms of affecting European policies in the Middle East. The EU has always taken a very balanced sort of two-state solution approach in respect to the Middle East. It's been put under a lot of pressure by the events of the last year. But they didn't, Middle Eastern issues didn't really focus very much in the European elections, which was perhaps a bit of a surprise given how radicalizing, particularly among young people, the Israel-Gaza problem had been. And I think some people expected that it would actually be really quite damaging. But it wasn't entirely clear to which political parties it would be most damaging. In fact, I'm not aware of anybody having seen it as a significant political force. Also,
Final question, so final two.
Yes, thank you for your remarks. My question has to do about defense. You mentioned that you expect the defense budget to increase, and you mentioned some of the 4Ds that would increase the autonomy of the European defense project. Do you expect with that and with the center of gravity shifting towards the right, do you see that or expect this to be more collaborative among the member states going forward?
The concept I proposed for the Martin Center is something in 10 steps, where the lower steps fit quite nicely into existing policies but need more funding. So, for example, we have already some works on cooperation during catastrophes, fire, but war, I think, would also be a major. Military mobility is another one. An EU DARPA, so to provide some of the funds from the research budget, which is quite a volume. Also for kind of double use research is something else, let's say, that could be done. So there you are still in typical EU policies. If we are thinking about space, again, in terms of thinking about where we have big capability gaps, is also something which is not completely foreign to the European Union. So there are a lot of things which would create the base or creating a real internal market for defense. So there are a lot of things which are in the traditional remit of the European Union, which need maybe different policies, additional funding, before we really come to what we normally imagine to be defense or what has to do with uniforms or military headquarters and so on. And I think what needs to be done now is that the basis is being created for a European defense, given that let's say, our environment has become much more friendly. And that can be done largely within the existing remit of EU policies.
I can just add one short remark to that. I think there's been a huge change in the last 4 or 5 years in respect of attitudes towards NATO in Brussels. This is transformational in the sense that I think both in NATO and in the EU, both sides see the other organisation as naturally complementary. That the EU can do certain things, for example, in cyber, for example, military mobility, whatever. Obviously, NATO is more of a hard power construct. But that the development of a properly functioning European single market in defence is critical for getting more bang for the buck, simply. And this change, I think, is huge and prepares the ground psychologically for the next steps that Klaus was talking about.
Final question.
What is it? Only enlargement in a very deep freeze? Or?
Well, enlargement. I mean, everything I think is overshadowed by the question of Ukraine. The outcome in Ukraine will affect what happens in Georgia and other countries that have been offered the prospect of enlargement in that sphere. And in the Balkans, as I'm sure you know, things seem just astonishingly bogged down in a way that's really quite debilitating. My own personal view is that enlargement to Ukraine is a necessity. And when the European Union is confronted with necessity, it normally finds the will to act. So solutions will be found in that regard, probably in respect of staged enlargement, so that the CAP or some other difficult components are taken out of the equation. But now the most serious and most difficult component of that has become the issue of potential military guarantee. Previously, it was assumed that would be developed or provided for by Ukraine becoming part of NATO. The emerging view now seems to be that NATO enlargement to Ukraine is much less likely. That then, I think, makes it more likely, back to the previous question, that the EU will develop a much stronger defence capability, much more quickly, and with a much more serious edge to it. But the Balkans, I just don't know.
I would argue that normally we would not seriously consider enlargement with the countries concerned, because Ukraine is in war, Moldova is deeply divided, Bosnia and Herzegovina is not a functioning state, Serbia is not very friendly, Kosovo is not recognized by everybody. The problem is, if we leave a grey area between the European Union and on the other side, Russia, who tries to re-establish empire, that area is very likely territory of war. So the question is, I don't think we can leave this gray area. And therefore, we have to choose between two difficult situations. If not, one is wonderful and the other has difficulty, but we need to choose between two difficult situations. I could imagine that if you look to the Balkans, a country which is quite well advanced, I was recently there, is Montenegro. Another one who needs making progress is Albania. Montenegro is a very small country, a couple of 100,000 people. It at least would demonstrate that the process is still alive. They hope to be able to close the chapters, I think, 2027. Albania a little bit afterwards. So, on the other hand, France is saying no, everybody at the same time. So difficult debates ahead of us, but we can't leave this in a gray area. That's too dangerous for the countries, but also for ourselves.
Thank you very much to our two speakers this evening, Klaus and Antony, for sharing your expertise and thoughts. I hope you've enjoyed the conversation, and if you want to, we can continue to have an informal chat after the seminar. Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Yeah, I sent you a second. One of them gone. No, it's Sarah. When you come up, run them past me again. Yeah, right, exactly.